Hello guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Tutorials. This is episode 2 in a multi-part series going over the components of tankiness, and as you can see from the writing above my head, we are going to be talking about damage reduction today. Damage reduction is a very important component of pretty much all tanking, whether you're playing an MMO, or whether you're playing Diablo 2, or whether you're playing Diablo 4, doesn't really matter. However, it's very important that you separate damage reduction out into multiple categories. Ooh, burpee there. Multiple categories, and I have these categories here for you. So first off is flat damage reduction. Flat damage reduction is a category that's very important, and it's probably the most important, as you can see here from the number 1 that I've written next to it. Flat damage reduction can be obtained in a myriad of ways. Things like flat damage reduction on your pants. You can get up to 10.7% on your pants. You can also get flat damage reduction from your armor, and you can also get a flat damage reduction from your armor value. However, that is going to be covered in a separate video because that is actually not static, and flat damage reduction is classified as something that does not change, and this is important. So flat damage reduction always applies, and we can add in here, does not change. This is very important. Flat damage reduction is the most important stat that you can have for tankiness because it utilizes your HP to its maximum bonus. As we went over in the previous video, if I am a tank who is trying to take a 100,000 damage hit from a boss, and I have 85% DR, then I need to have 15,000 HP. I have to have at least 15,000 HP to be able to absorb the hit. In fact, 15,001, otherwise I will immediately die. However, if I am a tank and I have a boss who's going to hit me for 100,000 HP and I only have 70,000 or 70% DR, then I now have to have 30,001 HP, which is a much greater contrast between the two. And you start to realize that DR is extremely effective at reducing the damage that you are taking from large hits so that your HP does not have to be as high to absorb that damage. Which means that a 70% DR tank with 30,000 life, or let's say 30,001, can only take one hit. The subsequent next hit will kill him. However, the 80% DR tank with 30,000 life, or 30,001, can take 2 hits. Which is basically going to, let's put that at 2 so that we have the 2 hits specifically. But he can take 2 hits. And the reason why this is because if he doesn't have the actual DR that he needs, and I forgot to type in 85 there, if you don't have the DR that you need, you are going to be in a world of hurt. You don't want to be one-shot. So flat DR and DR of all different types can definitely help you out. Flat DR is the most important, and it's the one that doesn't change, and it always applies to you no matter what. This one is always going to be above the others. There's no situation where you're ever going to be in where flat DR is not going to be better than the other options on this list. Now, the second option on this list, or the second component of DR, is conditional DR. Now, conditional DR is interesting because it can always apply as long as you are under the conditions that it is requiring you to be under. And this is very important because if you are not under the conditions that it is requiring you to be under, then you are not going to get the effects. So the question becomes, can you reliably fulfill this condition? If you can reliably fulfill the condition, then you are in an amazing place. So conditional DR is going to become essentially almost as good, not quite, but almost as good as flat DR, if you can always fulfill the condition. However, if you cannot, fulfill the condition, then it becomes less useful. This demotes it, in my opinion, to below intermittent DR. which honestly turns it into a number 3. So if you cannot always fulfill the condition to have this conditional DR applied to your character, then it actually goes down, in my opinion, to a number 3 slot. And intermittent DR is actually put above it. Conditional DR is things like, on my pants, you'll see I have 18.9% damage reduction while fortified. So the condition is I need to have the monster fortified to be able to get this effect. And if the monster is, I need to be fortified to get this effect. And if I am not fortified, then I do not get the effect. So the stat is wasted if I cannot maintain my fortified status. And so I would never recommend building any of these conditional fortifications or conditional damage reductions unless you can reliably maintain that condition. If you can reliably maintain the condition, then definitely run it, 100%. I would do it every single time. However, it is important to remember that conditional DR has a failing that a lot of people don't realize, and it's basically that you have to apply the condition to make it work. So there are going to be situations where the condition is going to fall off. There is going to be times when the conditional DR is not going to be applying. Whether it is that you got crowd controlled and you couldn't poison the target for 5 seconds and the poison fell off, so you're no longer getting your while poisoned damage reduction, or maybe you were unable to maintain your fortified status and your while fortified damage reduction falls off. There's 100 different things that can go on that can cause a conditional DR to de-apply from a target, and during those times, even if it's just at the beginning of the fight while you're trying to apply your debuffs to the target, at that moment that you no longer have access to your conditional DR, you are extremely weak. So it's important to remember that. The last one, which I honestly think is the worst of the lot, is intermittent DR. Now, intermittent DR is essentially the process by which you have a cooldown, which you utilize to save your life. Intermittent DR is very easy to spot. Bone Storm is an intermittent DR. It is a spell, lasts for 10 seconds, and applies a 15% damage reduction to me while it is active. That is a intermittent damage reduction. So while Bone Storm is active, I have a 15% additional damage reduction, which will assist me in reducing all damage incoming very nicely, right? But the thing is it only lasts for 10 seconds. So I'm only tanky for 10 seconds. This is DR that only applies when activated, and usually only for a short period of time, like for instance with my Bone Storm, which is 10 seconds. Intermittent DR is there to save your life from an attack that would otherwise kill you. And I need to stress this point because I think a lot of people don't understand this. You cannot rely on intermittent DR to save you 100% of the time. If you are relying on your intermittent DR to save your life every single time you go into battle, every single time you fight, then you honestly have a very poorly made character, in my opinion. Because the intermittent DR is not there to save your life every single time you get into trouble. The intermittent DR is there to save your life from an attack that would otherwise kill you. There's no greater way that I can explain this than in a boss battle. And this is one of the ways that a lot of players will make themselves known that they're a noob in tanking when it comes to MMOs. Bosses, especially raid bosses, usually have 1 or 2 telegraphed attacks that will kill you. They will absolutely 100% kill you. You can be the biggest, most godly tank that ever existed. You can have the thickest armor and the broadest shield, and you can have literally shock absorbers installed in there and armor made out of mithril and adamantium. It doesn't matter. Raid bosses have attacks that will kill you 100% of the time unless you use an ability that is generally referred to as a defensive cooldown. Defensive cooldowns are there to save your life when you would otherwise die. In MMOs, burning a defensive cooldown when you do not need it often results in the death of the tank, because then, several seconds later, when the boss uses his big attack, which will kill you 100% of the time, and you do not have a defensive cooldown available to protect yourself from this attack that will 100% kill you, you die. And then, generally what happens is when the boss kills the tank, unless you have a subsequent second tank that can just take over at a whim, which sometimes happens, the whole raid pretty much wipes. Because at that point, the healer now has permanent aggro, because she has been healing you the entire time, or he has been healing you the entire time, and he has built up a huge amount of aggro, which is very difficult for another tank to take over. Now, you might be lucky if the subsequent secondary tank has a force taunt, but this is getting into the mechanics of MMOs, and it's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the fact that if you burn a defensive cooldown all of the time, if you're always burning defensive cooldowns to save your life, then when you need the defensive cooldown to save your life, at that moment when it is most crucial, it will be missing. And that is when you are going to die, because you do not have the defensive cooldown to save your life. Intermittent DR is among the worst damage reduction in the game, because it is a DR that has to be saved for important moments that you need it for. If you're constantly willy-nillying, just spamming the button over and over again, then chances are there are going to be tons of situations that come into play where you're going to need it, but not have it. And this is one of the biggest failings of intermittent DR, is just simply the fact that you literally have to be tactical in the use of intermittent DR. Now, one of the ways that I've seen some of the players in Diablo 4 deal with the fact that monsters will clap them cheeks is they are literally only fighting monsters when their intermittent DR is up, which makes for some very boring content. Basically, what this involves is you find a pack of monsters, you wait for your cooldowns so that all your cooldowns are available, you pop said cooldowns, go in, kill the monsters, and hopefully kill them before your cooldowns run out, and then once your cooldowns run out, you then hide around a corner waiting for your cooldowns to come back before you engage the next pack. Now, this is a very odd way to play the game, in my opinion, but it definitely does work, because in this situation, you are fulfilling the goal of the intermittent cooldown, which is essentially, it is there to save your life. And you are making sure that any time that you are encountering the monsters, you have it up, so it is always up, and it then becomes very similar to conditional DR, which is if you force it to always be up, then it will save your life in every encounter that you go into. But conditional DR is not always up, because you can't always fulfill the condition, and intermittent DR is not always up because it is generally on cooldown. So cooldowns, right? So the only way that you can make intermittent DR into a form of flat DR is to literally wait for the cooldown to reset before you do any fight. And this is, of course, under the assumption that you can end the fight before your conditional cooldown is gone. So before your intermittent DR is gone. So for instance, if I have Bone Storm and Bone Storm lasts for 10 seconds and I need Bone Storm to survive an encounter, then I have to finish the encounter in 10 seconds, basically. Otherwise, I'm probably going to end up killed. Now, the cool thing about Bone Storm, which is something that a lot of the other defensive cooldowns have as well, is that it will provide you with a barrier. Now, I do plan on covering barriers a little bit later in this, but barriers, like for instance the one that comes from Bone Storm, which is a 5% barrier that gives you a damage reduction essentially equivalent to whatever your damage reduction was at the time. This is something that I've encountered with barriers, and it definitely seems to be the truth, is that barriers snapshot your DR at the time of creation. So this is important when it comes to these three categories, which is flat DR, conditional DR, and intermittent DR. All right? So what this means is that if you have all of your conditional DR active, you have all of your intermittent DR active, and you have your flat DR is always active, of course, and then you create a barrier with all forms of damage reduction active, the barrier seems to snapshot the damage reduction of that moment for the HP that it creates for you. That's what it seems like to me, anyway. And this is a component specifically unique to Diablo, because not all of the games will do this specific thing. So some games just simply give you a barrier, and the barrier fluctuates in damage reduction, but it definitely does seem like the damage reduction of the barriers seems to be specific to what your damage reduction is at that particular time. So if you have crappy damage reduction when you create the barrier, then you are going to have a crappy barrier. This has actually been displayed quite well by Temerity. So if you guys have never seen Temerity, let me actually show a pair of Temerity pants to you. Temerity is a unique item which basically allows you to create almost infinite barriers from overhealing yourself. And the barrier that it creates can be up to 80% of your maximum life. But the problem is that by putting them on, you are removing your defensive pants. Your defensive pants can have flat damage reduction, can have damage reduction while fortified, can have damage reduction while poisoned, damage reduction while bleeding, can have all forms of damage reduction on them. In fact, you can quad stack them. I need a much better pair of pants, by the way. But you can quad stack the damage reductions, which means that when you create a barrier with all of this damage reduction in place, it is a much stronger barrier than the one that Temerity gives you, because Temerity is giving you a barrier that does not contain those damage reduction attachments. And essentially it works as an additional life source, right? So in the situation of the tank who was trying to absorb that massive hit from a boss, a temporary barrier could absorb some of that damage and enable them to have a temporary increase in hit points for the duration of a large attack which is coming in. I like to refer to barriers as temporary temp hit points. Temp hit points are something that can save your life in some very, sneaky situations. They can also allow you to heal yourself. And this is where DR comes in, because DR is required to make these temporary hit points actually useful. Because if you don't have the damage reductions to make the barrier useful, then the barrier is just going to get one shot. And this is something that happens a lot when it comes to the Temerity pants. You will put them on, you'll get this really nice 80% maximum life barrier, right? And then the monster just goes up and goes boop, and then the barrier is gone. Because the barrier has no damage reduction attached to it, it's terrible. And so it's essentially like a situation where you have, say, a boss that's hitting you for 100,000 damage, right? And, the tank has 85% damage reduction, right? But a non-tank might only have like 25% damage reduction, right? So you're not a tank at all. You're like a healer or something, right? But you apply a 50,000 HP barrier to yourself or whatever, right? And you have, say, I don't know, maybe you're just a HP whore, and you've got 50,000 HP as well. Well, you could potentially absorb the hit with that, because you've got 50,000 plus 50,000, which is 100,000 HP, and the barrier that you've created will help absorb some of that damage. You reduce that by 25%, and you're going to have about 25,000 life left. But how many healers do you know that out HP the tank, right? So in general, even if your barrier was, say, 75,000 HP with a 25% DR, it's not really going to be enough to save your life. And that's basically what happens all the time with the Temerity pants. I think I've pretty much covered damage reduction or flat damage reduction about as much as I possibly can. Damage reduction is definitely one of the best stats in the game for protecting yourself. At this particular point, it has been mathed out, and the math has basically shown that flat damage reduction from all damage reduction from close, and damage reduction from fortified, damage reduction while poisoned, damage reduction while bleeding, etc., 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 do actually outperform the damage reduction that you obtain from armor in basically all content, including high-level content. So take that as you will. We're going to be moving on to the next episode, and the next episode is going to be about avoidances. We'll be talking about avoidances next. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, and keep watching.